Hi, Kinder Kids. In the last story, you heard about the capital city of Washington, D.C. Remember, a president is the elected leader of a country. The president has a lot of responsibilities because he or she helps lead the country. You also heard about different monuments in Washington, D.C. that were created to honor past presidents. There are many other ways to remember and honor people. For example, you can hear stories about the great things they did. In today's story, you will hear about the actions of our first president, George Washington. After today's story of a dishonest story about an honest man, you will be able to name George Washington as someone admired for his honesty. Let's go over a vocabulary first. Our vocabulary word is respect. Respect is to think well of someone because of something he or she did. It also means to admire. For example, I respect police officers who risk their lives to save other people. Let's get right to the story. Almost everyone likes a good story. Some people especially like true stories that tell how real people did real things. Other people say, I love made-up stories best. A person who tells this kind of story can decide to leave in only the most interesting parts and even make sure there will be a happy ending. However, there is a third kind of story that mixes together true and made-up stories. Today's story is an example of this third type of story, and it is what we call a legend. It is called a dishonest story about an honest man. This story is about George Washington, a real person, who acts in the story in an honest way as he often acted in real life. The true part of the story is that George Washington was a real person and he was very honest. The made-up part is that he cut down his father's cherry tree. This is young George Washington with his father, Augustine Washington. Augustine Washington loved his farm by the river. He loved the rolling green meadows in which he raised horses and other animals. He loved the woods. He loved the rich soil that allowed him to grow plants for food on the farm or to sell in town. He loved the fruit trees on his farm that gave him beautiful flowers in spring, delicious fruit through the summer and autumn, and graceful shapes to look at in winter. Augustine especially loved his cherry trees. When his son George was about 5 years old, Augustine said, George, I will teach you which sorts of cherry trees to grow best here and how to take care of them so that they will grow tall and strong and give delicious fruit. Were Augustine's cherry trees important to him? How can you tell? So you can imagine how upset Augustine was to find one day that someone had chopped down one of his prized trees. This particular day, he was walking with his foreman, a man who worked for him and helped him run his farm. Augustine said, this was no accident. Someone did it on purpose. Look how neat a job of cutting it this was. No wild animal could have done that. Who would do such a thing? His foreman replied, I just can't imagine who would have the nerve to do it, sir, or the reason. Who do you think cut down the tree? Caught up in their conversation, the two men did not notice little George Washington approaching from the house. The boy silently listened to the two grown-ups. He looked at his father's face and saw disappointment and anger. George stepped up, looking pale and worried. To the shock of his father and the foreman, George said quietly but firmly, Father, I cannot lie. I chopped down the tree with my little axe. I wanted to see if I could do it, but now I know it was a bad thing to do. Augustine Washington looked at his son. He could see from the expression on his face how badly George felt. Meanwhile, the foreman, surprised by the little boy's confession, turned back to look at Augustine Washington. He thought, Mr. Washington sometimes has a very bad temper. Poor George, I hate to think what is about to happen to him. But to his surprise, he heard the father tell his son, It was a bad thing to do, George, and you should be punished for doing it. However, I so respect you for coming forward and telling me the truth, that if you will promise not to do such a thing again, I shall not punish you. I promise, Father, said George, and he kept that promise. So you see, Even as a young boy, George Washington was honest and took responsibility for his actions. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of us could be like that? That is the famous legend of George Washington and the cherry tree. It's important to remember that this story about George Washington and the cherry tree is a legend because it is partly true and partly made up. You might ask, was George Washington really an honest man? Actually, he was. After he grew up and became President of the United States, one of the things for which he was most famous for was his honesty. What is even more interesting is the way in which people looked up to the real George Washington. Washington was not perfect. He made mistakes, as everyone does at times. A few times he made decisions with which his friends disagreed. When that happened, they usually said, "We would have chosen differently, but we know he made this choice for a good reason, and not just to help himself." Even the King of Great Britain, King George III, admired Washington. After King George lost control of the colonies to the people there, who now thought of themselves as Americans, he expected Washington to make himself king of the new nation. Instead, Washington decided to give up control of the army he led and go home to Mount Vernon, his farm in northern Virginia. When King George heard George Washington's plan, he said, "If he can do that, he is the greatest man in the world." Do you think King George respected George Washington? Why or why not? George Washington is often described as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. There are many reasons for that. George Washington was one of the most important leaders in winning the war that freed us from the control of Great Britain and his king. Washington was one of the most important people involved in setting up the new government and starting the new country in the right direction. He was also the most admired and trusted person in that new country. Today, we still look up to George Washington. In fact, he is considered one of our greatest national heroes. His face is on the front of the $1 bill and on the front of the quarter. All across America, there are cities, towns, and streets named after him, from Washington, D.C. to the state of Washington. More than 200 years after he died, and some people still ask, what would Washington do when making important decisions? George Washington never chopped down that cherry tree, but he left us something that blossoms brightly in all the seasons. The example of a brave and honest man. The end. What kind of story is the story of George Washington and the cherry tree? Why is the story of George Washington and the cherry tree considered a legend? In this legend, who cut down the cherry tree? In real life, why do you think George Washington did not make himself king? Have these discussions with your family.